Apologies from Councillor Coyle, who was not able to come this evening to welcome you. So I'm going to hand straight over to Ian Thomas, our Strategic Director for Children and Younger Adults. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jeanette. Can people hear me at the back if I use this? That's great. It's interesting, the decision to film wasn't our bright idea, it came from you. So one of the suggestions from governors was that for people living busy lives, wouldn't it be great if we could film it and put it on YouTube? And I've been told that if you don't want to be filmed, sit at the back, but there's no more spaces at the back left for me. So here I am at the front doing this. And another year's gone past, and another year of getting older. I've got some silver things appearing in my hair. Maybe it's a result of the job. And I was having a discussion with my daughter about this, a true story this is, and she said, "Don't worry, Dad, at least getting old, you won't have to worry about your earlier indiscretions being all over the internet." So I thought it was a bit optimistic. I also wondered what she'd been doing at university for the last 3 years, but there you go. So my presentation covers a number of key developments, and when I started a couple of years ago and presented to many people in this room and governors like you up and down the county, I talked about the department's financial challenges and the departmental structure, and I think it's quite important. I did receive some feedback as to why is Thomas going on about this when we're here to represent our schools. Well, it's because it's incredibly important. The funding for local government is facing unprecedented cuts, and many of those services that wrap around your schools we either provide or commission. So it's really, really important to get our challenges into some sort of context. So just a brief track and canter through history. CSR, Comprehensive Spending Review 2010, signalled massive cuts for local government. The Kaya share of the 100 million for this council was around £29 million. That is up until today, and that's what's been shaved from our budget. There was a CSR, Comprehensive Spending Review 2013, which signalled another 10% of cuts. And then the authority was in a very precarious position between where we are now and 2017-18, with having to find £127 million, in terms of reduced expenditure by 2017-18. Then the government said, well, I'll tell you what, we'll do some more. So in the summer, Department of Communities and Local Government launched a consultation on further cuts again to our budget, which means that this authority has to now find £157 million by 2017-18. Just to put that into context for you, that means that we'll be spending a third less than we are today by 2017. It's not, £30 million, then you add it up over 5 years, as I've heard some people say. It's a real cut of £157 million. And you can't do that without really modernising the way that you work and reducing some of what you do. So we're going to have to jettison some of our services. I'm pretty sure of that. And members have been working really hard at this authority with officers like myself to determine what the priorities are for this council. And it's easy where we're sat now and in this room saying, well, children are the future, children are the priority. But when I tell you that in terms of adult social care, as an example, this authority are facing significant challenges in terms of numbers of older people. There's a critical issue in terms of dementia, an issue in terms of provision for those over 85 years of age, and an issue regarding the sufficiency of residential care places. So my discussions with colleagues is about, well, what's the argument for trying to protect as far as possible children's services provision? And you can imagine those discussions around the table. They're very, very difficult discussions, and we haven't yet settled on what we need to deliver in terms of our cut. But those cuts will affect all of us. I guarantee you that. Thank you. In terms of where we are thus far with the Kaya budget, we've got savings in excess of £15 million more to find. And some of the ideas around the savings were reported to full council recently. So we talked about reducing the care costs with fewer children in care, which we're already on with, reducing management and back office costs, and it's very simple to say, you know, reduce your back office, reduce your management, but if you think about your own context in your own schools and the roles that these people play in terms of associate staff, these are people and these are real jobs. Not easy by any stretch of the imagination. Review of careers guidance in secondary schools, we're doing that already and achieving some savings there. Changes to home to school transport, and the authority will soon be going out to consultation with a view to asking the people of Derbyshire whether or not we should still be subsidising transport for children that attend faith schools. And at the moment we still spend around £900,000. I led a review here in 2008 that led to the introduction of charges for children going to denominational schools. And the question we're putting to the public is, should we continue to subsidise that when we're facing such swinging cuts? The other area is about whether or not we should introduce charges for young people post-16 travelling to school. We are aware of some cases where we will pay transport for a young person to go to school that has some additional needs, but yet that same young person will be travelling independently at the weekend for their leisure activities and, you know, joining in fun with their friends. We can't afford to do that any longer. We have to find ways of delivering in a different way. And there is a bit of an economic argument. So when people talk about, you know, cuts to services and cuts to early intervention, many of you will be familiar with our multi-agency teams, the MAT teams and children's centres. We're talking about these sorts of services. But my economic argument is that if you cut these services too deeply, then you face more challenging difficulties later on in having to intervene and place more children into care. It costs more in terms of the issues you're managing in your schools around behaviour, around exclusion, and all the poor outcomes associated with those social pressures that we face. Quite frankly, I've worked out that if we were to cut those preventative services that wrap around many of your schools, the authority could face a really critical situation. I estimate that in terms of bringing more kids into care, it could cost us pretty quickly an extra £26 million, because in Derbyshire we're already way below the average. We have around 4,500 children in need, and if you take a proportion of those that are coming into the care system, that will cost us even more. And we won't have our stock of foster carers, we won't have contract carers, and therefore we will have to place these children in expensive residential placements and often far away from where they live. So not ideal. So in terms of the key financial challenges and issues for schools, and there are always some, aren't there? I thought I'd just report on school balances. So nursery school, and this would have been easier in the millions actually, but 304k in terms of balances. Secondary, 11.6 million that would be. Primary, 18.2 million, special 1.7 million, aggregating to a total of around £32 million worth of balances held in schools. Governors need to assure yourselves that those balances are being held for the right reason. You know, we talk, don't we, about having reserves and having money for a rainy day. I know many of you are facing issues around falling roles, and because of cuts to devolved formula capital, are saving for capital developments, and that's quite right and a good use of those resources. But you need to be challenging school leaders around the level of those resources, and just to ensure and just to double check that they're not being held without good reason. The DSG, the Dedicated Schools Grant, we've got balances there of around £23 million. Now, in terms of some of the use for those balances, what we'll be talking to your school leaders about will be about increasing the lump sum for secondary by £25,000, which will cost £1.1 million. If we were designing the system from scratch, we wouldn't have the same block allowance for the two sectors. We would separate it, recognising that secondary schools tend to be larger in terms of the infrastructure around them. This next bullet point, release of capped gains under the formula changes. So, as you'll be aware, you're protected in terms of turbulence by a minimum funding guarantee of minus 1.5%. To enable us to afford that, we've capped the gains also in terms of a fairer system. So we are currently out in terms of a consultation to look at continuing that. Contribution to school equal pay and single status issues. So where we think there might be some liabilities from groups of staff being unfairly paid in the past, that presents an equal pay liability for us, and we need to ensure that we're providing well for that and being prudent around it. But looking ahead, as I'm sure you all are, to single status and doing that slotting job, this could present challenges for us in terms of ongoing revenue pressure. So the council went through single status and it cost us an additional £13 million to the pay bill. We know there are winners and losers. However, there could be a cost, and we are preparing well for that. Expanded traded service offers to schools. So we're thinking here about whether or not we can pool our resources and think in a much more strategic way about managing our pressures together. There are some services that are funded by the Dedicated Schools Grant, the DSG, that the council runs, and what I'm talking about is whether or not we can review those services, modernise those services, and give you guys more spending power to enable you to pool that resource with us on some of our areas that are under threat. And support for any loss of funding due to the national DSG changes. As you're aware, the government are looking at introducing a single formula, and there could be losses as a result of that, so we need to prepare well for it. There's a current consultation taking place, and I'd urge you to log on to that and contribute, as it will have some sort of impact on your schools. When you think about all the financial reforms that have taken place over the years, we've done pretty well in Derbyshire. We've got very, very talented finance people working on various models. It's a very complicated system since LMS in 1993 was introduced. And in that time, I've probably come across 5 schools since 1990 that have been in dire straits, real difficulties, and I've personally been involved in 4 of the 5, but we've seen it through. So when you consider that we oversee 422 schools in terms of financial allocations, that's not a bad record. So in terms of the key actions for you guys as governors, and I think that I'd want to reiterate what Jeanette said in terms of being very grateful for the work that you do, because none of this is easy. But in terms of your key actions, and what I'd ask you to consider is to respond to the consultation. It is critical. It will impact, or could impact, on the money that your schools receive. Changes aren't as significant as previous years, but they are still important. We need your view, because this is an annual requirement, on the repooling of funding for some of the stuff we've already agreed to pool in previous years, such as insurances, contingency funds and the like. The national funding formula, which is what the Secretary of State wants to introduce, to be phased in from April 2015. Details are still being awaited from the DFE, but that will look at a single funding formula for transparency. There will be regional variations, but with no details as to what that might look like. And just be aware that whilst the headline is that education's protected and National Health Service is protected, you are facing a real terms cut to your budget, because there's no additional cash for that 1% pay rise that you'll have to pay your staff. So just be aware of that. Okay. Moving on to my reflections about school performance, and I'll take questions at the end, if I may, on all of this stuff. When I first took over in 2011, I did kind of raise the alarm about Key Stage 4. The story does continue for Derbyshire in that we've had a very strong performance profile in our primary sector. We have a strong early years foundation stage at the age of 5 for kids here in Derbyshire. And I think that reflects, I think, the support in the early years that we have here in this local authority. That continues on to Key Stage 1, where there is some exemplary performance still, and it goes on into Key Stage 2. And that's reflected in the school performance. So whereas last year, roughly at this time, we were looking at 62% of our primary schools good or better, we're now at 77%. And as governors, you play a key role in that in terms of leadership around the Ofsted framework. And my colleague Russ will talk more about that later on in the session this evening. However, when you look at secondary, there is a contrasting picture. 43%, just 43% of our secondaries are good or better. We've had a spate of inspections since the start of this term, and many of those outcomes have been negative for us. I think there's a reflection of the challenges we face in progress in English. I think there's a reflection, in terms of our closing the gap for vulnerable groups, those on free school meals, those with special educational needs, as examples. And also our headline figures, and this is a sort of silver lining here. So the headline figures in terms of our Key Stage 4 performance has improved, and I'll say a bit more about that later. But if you look at that bottom bullet point, whilst in primary we're almost in line with the average at 79%, in secondary we're around 30 percentage points behind the pack in terms of the average figure. So the average figure is 73% in terms of schools that are good or better. In Derbyshire, just 43%. So a stark figure, and something that Ofsted will look at, because they're now starting to audit, inspect the role that local authorities play in supporting schools to improve. Thanks. Looking at the performance by key stages, I talked about Key Stage 1 and the exemplary performance, particularly in our core subjects, reading, writing, maths, science. And Key Stage 2, in the new measures, reading, writing, maths, we are a couple of percentage points above the national average. We were 4 percentage points above that last year, and that trend continues in terms of being above the national average. The really good news is that those at level 5 or above the aspirational target, we do better there as well. So our smart kids are getting even smarter. At Key Stage 3, it doesn't look too bad, actually. So, we're seeing that performance kind of continue in terms of the teaching assessments. Not bad, but it's at Key Stage 4 where it gets a little bit tricky. And it gets tricky, as I said before, for our vulnerable groups, those on free school meals, those with SEN. We've bucked the trend in those with in our care, for children in our care. Last year we had a really awful figure. This year we're the best ever at 17%. So that focused attention on improving children in care outcomes in this authority has paid off, because we were around 6% last year, we're at 17% this year. However, when you look at the headline 5A to C, including English and maths, we've seen a 1.2% increase. A 1.2% increase. We will be at around 58.4%. Whereas nationally, we're seeing a decrease in GCSEs for that measure of between 0.5% and 1%. So I expect that when the results are validated, we'll be slightly, ever so slightly, above the national average. At Key Stage 5, that's the A-level stage, we do okay. So in terms of the average point scores, we've got some work to do there, but we've got a higher overall pass rate, which can be celebrated. But we do need to do more in terms of the aspirational A to A-star achievement. So that's the sort of position and performance. It would be remiss of me, given what's been reported in the news most recently, not to talk about safeguarding in the school's context and in terms of your responsibilities, our collective responsibilities to keep children safe. So I wanted to talk about the tragedy around Daniel Pelker, aged 4 years, 8 months, in Coventry. A very, very tragic case, but for the first time in many a while, and I have not seen this, issues for schools identified in the serious case review, more prominently than in other occasions that I've seen. It talks about an issue that you'll recognise, and when we have a primary head in the room. kids coming to school. This particular young boy came to school with bruises. No record of onward referral was made. And they were seen by different school staff members too. This young boy was scavenging through bins because of not being fed very well. And it's a clear case of you and your school leaders and school staff being quite often the first people to see signs of abuse and neglect. And I've written to all school leaders to talk to them about this, to talk to them about how we can improve our processes locally, but also to give me some assurance that, when you look at statutory guidance, there's some statutory guidance called Working Together 2013, and you have an excerpt in your pack. It's got annex at the top. And forgive the misspelling. I did get my O-level English. Forgive the misspelling, but it does talk about your responsibilities. And that annex derives from a document called Working Together 2013, which is statutory guidance, and that's your responsibility for schools under the Education Act 2002, Section 157 for maintained schools and Section 175 for academy schools. I've also included in the pack 10 best practice areas about what your school safeguarding policies should look like. And I'm pleased to say that we'll be, on behalf of all of you, drafting a model safeguarding policy for you to consider adopting by your respective governing bodies. Thank you. In terms of some of the recommendations, it's that role, isn't it, of designated teacher and recording these injuries and sharing information. I don't want to be at the front of County Hall, facing the press, talking about lessons learned. We need to be proactive around sharing information and ensuring that we run the safest systems that we possibly can. Clearly understood the role of the designated professional within your schools. That has to be there. The child's voice must be heard. Too many times we've seen it where people are not considering what the child says to us. The staff should take responsibility for keeping their child protection up to date. The other thing is that it would be important for there to be a designated governor, I think, for child protection and safeguarding. That will also assist yourselves in terms of managing your own inspections under the framework, Section 5 inspections, and I think that would be incredibly useful. It's not just Daniel Pelker. There was a case in Bradford, a guy called a young child, Hamza Khan, who tragically died at the hands of his mother through neglect and starvation. And in that household there were 5 other siblings, aged between 5 and 13. The house was in a squalid condition, and as far as I'm concerned, and the serious case review isn't out yet, but it'll be interesting to see what kind of signs there were that were exhibited by those other siblings, the 5 to 13-year-olds, which kind of cuts across all your schools in this room. Okay, on that note, I'm going to pause. There's quite a bit to take in there. We covered finances, we covered school performance, and critically, we covered safeguarding. And I'm happy to take any questions, even difficult ones. Have we got a roving mic?
Testing.
You can raise your hand if there are any, and it can be on any issues.
Hello, my name is Julie Brown. I'm Chair of the Governor at Benley Special School in Ilkeston. One thing I have noted is that when you talked about performance of schools with the Ofsted judgments, there were no mention of special schools, secondary, primary, but no special schools.
Okay, absolutely right, and noted for next time. Especially, there is a good story to tell, actually, in terms of our special schools. We tend to do generally well, but you're quite right to pick up on that gap in our reporting. I'll ensure it doesn't happen again. Thank you.
Diaphragm Wealth, Chair of Governors at Frishley School. You said you got a model policy in the draft for safeguarding.
Under development, yes.
How long will it be, do you know?
Okay, well, I asked head teachers to give me some feedback on safeguarding processes, the referral process into the local authority, our ability to feed back to you, quality of training, etc. And I asked for that feedback to be with me by the 15th of October. When that date has passed, we will analyse all your responses and group them into themes. And shortly after that, I will be issuing the safeguarding policy for you to consider, the model policy. Thank you. Anything else?
Aaron Eccleston, Chair of Governors at Belfast School and Sixth Form Centre. Ian, how do you rationalise the improvement in the Key Stage 4 results with the decline in the number of and percentage of schools judged to be good or outstanding at secondary level?
I think it's a really good question. So Alan's asking from Belfast School, if you look at there's our results being broadly in line with the national average, how do you rationalise the decline in schools judged good or better? And I put that down, given the cases that I've seen, down to progress in English and a lack of, with particular emphasis, I'd have to say, on progress for vulnerable groups. So SEND kids, those on special educational needs and disabilities, children in care, those on free school meals, not doing our best, the best that we could do in terms of closing the gap. And that's how I'd rationalise it. And they are looking at every child. They'll look at your use of pupil premium. And we've talked about this before, haven't we? They will track your use of pupil premium to ensure that those entitled to it are getting that investment and that their outcomes are improving. And they'll drill down to the individual child. So we can't hide behind large-scale figures. They'll look at small groups as well. So it's really, really important that you get to grips with the use of pupil premium, that you're able to audit and track it and ensure as governors you're satisfied that it's being used for its intended purpose in driving up standards for those most vulnerable children and young people. As I say, Alan, we do have an issue with English. Russ will talk about it a bit later on, and we do need to get to grips with progress in English in particular across our secondary schools. So.
Hi David, Darley Primary. I wasn't going to ask the question, but you brought up the subject of pupil premium. I wonder if there are any thoughts being made by yourselves to the fact that the government are going to be funding for free school meals, etc., etc. So presumably parents won't have to fill in the form that says they need a free school meal, therefore how are we going to pick the fact that they need pupil premium?
Yeah. And your name was again, sorry?
David.
David, yeah, we met before, David. And,
Yeah.
you know, David's asking a question way above my pay grade. And that is, if you're looking at rolling out free school meals to all infants, and all infant schools and all infant age children, how are we going to determine who should get the pupil premium? And that is something that's not being resolved. It will have to be resolved, most certainly, but that's not a Derbyshire issue, it's a national one. And I think it's, you know, it's an interesting case of, you know, this part of the government making an announcement, but not necessarily thinking about how it's going to be delivered.
Presumably they're going to give you all the money and the county aren't going to have to find any to fund these meals.
And we'll live happily ever after. Okay. Room for one more? If not, we can move on. Okay, thanks for your attention.